Sammy.
I'm Gustavo, and together we're going to teach you about stabilization policies.
To begin, let's start off with fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is used in order to shift the aggregate demand curve. Now, why would the government want to shift the aggregate demand curve, you may ask? This is primarily because it wants to either close the recessionary gap, which is created when aggregate output falls below potential output, or an inflationary gap, which is created when aggregate output exceeds potential output. Now, there's two different types of fiscal policy: expansionary and contractionary. First, we have expansionary policy. Expansionary fiscal policy is used when there's a recessionary gap. It typically takes one of three forms: an increase in government purchases of goods and services, a cut in taxes, and an increase in government transfers. An expansionary fiscal policy, such as the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, pushes the aggregate demand curve to the right. Meanwhile, contractionary fiscal policy is used when there's an inflationary gap. It is implemented through either a reduction in government purchases of goods and services, an increase of taxes, and a decrease in government transfers. And contractionary fiscal policy, such as the Lyndon-Johnson tax surges, pushes the aggregate demand curve to the left. But why should you be cautious about fiscal policy? In the case of fiscal policy, one key reason for caution is that there are important time lags in its use. Because of these lags, an attempt to increase spending in response to a recessionary gap may take so long to get going that the economy will have already recovered by then. Now let's move on to monetary policy. Let's see how monetary policy, or changes in the money supply / the interest rate, compares to fiscal policy. The Federal Reserve uses some tools of monetary policy to prevent or address extreme macroeconomic fluctuations in the U.S. economy. Monetary policy has to do with the change of money supply. The policy is applied to shift the aggregate demand due to its ability to affect interest rate. Now let's take a look at the flowchart just to see how this all works. If you can see in the top, this is what happens when banks adopt an expansionary monetary policy. They increase the money supply, which in turn lowers the interest rate. Higher investment spending raises income. Higher consumer spending via the money multiplier turns into an increase in aggregate demand, causing the 80 curve to shift to the right. Now with contractionary, this is basically just the opposite of what just happened. So they decrease money supply, higher interest rates, lower investment spending reduces income, lower consumer spending via the money multiplier, and this all decreases the aggregate demand, and the 80 curve shifts to the left. Now to give a little history and kind of background on how this all works and why it works, the supply of loanable funds directly impacts growth in interest rates in an economy. Typically, an increase in the supply of loanable funds is associated with a decrease in interest rates. The greater the accessibility of loans as conferred by access and cost, the greater opportunity for businesses and consumers to make investment purchases and increase production and labor supply. Now, how does it do all of this? Well, there are three main tools under monetary policy. It's the reserve requirements, the discount rate, and open market operations. To review, the federal funds rate is the interest rate that banks charge other banks for loans. The second tool is the discount rate. If a bank is in need of reserves, it can also borrow from the Fed. The interest rate that the Fed charges on those loans is called the discount rate. And last, and in history, one of the most important tools is the open market operations. In an open market operation, the Federal Reserve buys or sells U.S. Treasury bills, normally through a transaction with commercial banks. Open market operations entail Fed intervention in the buying and selling of government bonds to achieve a change in the money supply and the corresponding change in the interest rate. The Fed sells bonds to reduce the money supply and increase prevailing interest rate, and buy bonds to increase the money supply and reduce prevailing interest rate. All the tools listed affect interest rate through a form of cause and effect. Now, I know I just threw a lot of information at you guys, so just to simplify it into a few words, fiscal policy deals with the government and taxation, meanwhile monetary policy deals with the money supply and interest rate.
Thank you, Sammy, for the elaborate explanation. Now I will discuss the Phillips curve. To begin, let's establish its primary purpose. The purpose of this curve is to illustrate the economic concept that inflation and unemployment have a stable and inverse relationship. However, the graph is a bit more complex than that, as it breaks into the short run and long run. The SRPC curve establishes a negative short run relationship between the unemployment rate and inflation rate, illustrated with a downward slope. This means that when inflation is high, unemployment is low, and vice versa. In addition, this model ties into the aggregate demand / aggregate supply model based on how changes in the aggregate price level and output gap depend on changes in aggregate demand. Furthermore, an increase in aggregate demand leads to a decrease in both the inflation rate and unemployment rate, as shown in the graph next to me. Also, increases and decreases in aggregate demand result in movements to the left and right along the SRPC curve, and supply shocks, which are sudden changes in oil, can also shift the SRPC curve. Finally, an increase in expected inflation shifts the SRPC curve upward and vice versa. Moving on to the long run situation, the LRPC shows the relationship between unemployment and inflation in the long run, after expectations of inflation have had time to adjust. This is represented by a vertical line, because any unemployment rate below the NAIRU leads to an accelerating inflation rate. The NAIRU, or the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, is defined as the unemployment rate at which inflation does not change over time. In other words, the long-run Phillips curve shows that there are actually limits to expansionary policies. They are not all-powerful, because an unemployment rate below the NAIRU cannot be maintained in the long run. All in all, the key takeaway from the LRPC is that to avoid accelerating inflation over time, the unemployment rate must be high enough so that the actual rate of inflation matches the expected rate of inflation. Demand pull inflation is inflation that is caused by an increase in aggregate demand. As shown in the graph, as the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right, the price level and real GDP increase due to typically an increase in government spending. On the other hand, cost push inflation is inflation that is caused by a significant increase in the cost of wages and raw materials. As a result of higher costs of production, the aggregate supply in the economy decreases, or shifts to the left, as shown in the graph next to me. This also leads to an increase in the price level and a decrease in the real GDP. This is a graph depicting the role of expectations in the Phillips curve. Because consumers can have certain expectations about future inflation rates based on current rates of unemployment and inflation, the inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment is only relevant in the short run. Thank you for listening. We hope you learned something new to get a 5 on that exam.
So we definitely appreciate it if we all pass. So when you get to this section of the exam, just think of this video and thank us.